Hello, I'm Dr. David Riley, and in this mini lecture we'll be going through survey techniques and different types of rating scales. So we'll just cover the very basics. What is a survey? So a survey is a set of questions, almost always standardized, tapping one or more psychological constructs. Now I say here almost always standardised because it's very important that each participant gets the same items, the same instructions and the same wordings. Unless you're doing some sort of randomised control where you offer a different set of instructions to different participants, they always need to be standardised. The one exclusion to that type of survey would be whether you have survey branching. So just as an example, if you were looking at romantic relationships and your sample was heterosexual, then if the participant had asked if they were answered they were male, then you might have your questions relating to their girlfriend or partner, whereas if the participant had answered female, they might be asked questions about their boyfriend or partner. But generally, because we want to be able to compare across groups, we don't tend to use branching surveys too much. Now, the items and importantly the instructions need to be carefully pilot tested for readability and clarity. Now, you as the researcher, well, you know what you intend to ask, but others will read it quite differently. And this is where sometimes we have just a little bit of a deficit in perspective taking and theory of mind. We can't put ourselves in the shoes of a patient or an employee who's filling out this survey. They may read it very differently to how we do. So the sample that you select for pilot testing, it needs to match your intended participants. So similarly aged and have a similar literacy level. Now, many surveys are written for an adult audience, but they use university student standard literacy. And that's not always appropriate when you're trying to go into the general population. One of the entry requirements for students coming in here on an entry visa is that they have a university standard of English. But you'll find that many of the actual university students who are Australian born, they will not meet that standard. So they have a much more basic literacy. And so certain words will trick them up or will be confusing or ambivalent. And so you really need to pilot test it with a very basic literacy audience to make sure that your instructions and your items are very clear. We generally recommend pilot testing with 10 to 20. Sometimes you may go for more, but certainly anything less than that, you're less likely to pick up errors in the items. Now, a survey is a set of questions that are administered to a sample of participants. Now, often it's a probabilistic sample, so it's randomly selected. And when we do that, we have a much better argument for generalising our conclusions to the general population. This is something that I'll pick up on in a future mini lecture. But that's what a survey study is. So there's separate components of the survey process, but researchers should equate a survey instrument design and the sampling with part of the survey process. So a survey design usually involves little or no assignment of participants to groups, unless you're delivering some sort of intervention. And we often use a larger sample than a lab or other type of study. The reason is we want to get a wider range of participants and we also want to reduce sampling error. Now, unlike a lab study in which sampling considerations are given less weight, We just take whoever's available. A survey study is heavily dependent on the sampling. If you don't have random sampling, then it's a serious threat to validity. So that's a topic covered in a later module. Now, a survey instrument also tends to include additional non-psychological variables. So these include demographic variables like age, gender, socioeconomic status to describe the sample. This is actually something that's poorly described in most studies that you'll read. But it's critically important to have an understanding of this if there's potentially moderators, either known moderators identified in meta-analyses or potentially unknown moderators that we've yet to identify. So if you're doing a literature review on your topic and you find there's a large degree of variability or heterogeneity in the size of the effect, that tells you there's probably moderators there. So you want to actually measure additional information about your sample. So just off the top of my head, socioeconomic status, that is a really strong moderator. If you're doing a clinical study, with the level of severity of symptoms, the length of time that the symptoms have been persisting for. If you're doing an organisational psychology study, or maybe employee morale, or wage disparities. There's extra information that is really easy to put in at the survey design stage, but once you've collected your data, it's too late. Now, a survey can be administered once, and that's generally what we'd call a cross-sectional design, where you might measure it across different age groups or perhaps across different socioeconomic status groups, or in the case of org psychology, different levels of employees on the employee hierarchy. Or you can administer it to the same targeting frame over time to study population change. So, studying gender norms of young adults, obviously this has changed in recent decades. So we might want to compare our study to previously collected samples with that instrument to track change over time. We might also want to administer more than once to the same people, so a longitudinal design. Generally when we think of longitudinal, we think of T1 and T2, or pre and post. But you can actually follow up people over a longer period to actually track change over time. Now I'm going to include a special mini lecture there on longitudinal designs, because one of the biggest issues and threats to the validity of the conclusions is issues of causation. And there are also various combinations and cohort designs where you have a mixture of cross-sectional and longitudinal. So this methodology was built from the ground up during the 20th century, and it generally involved things like mail surveys, telephone interviews, often in-personal interviews. So where you actually go out to the home of the person and or to the employee's organisation, and you conduct the interviews. But of course now we have the beauty of online, and that makes research incredibly more efficient. For the researcher, that means much less data collection time. And so a lot of your other time can be spent on either other duties or on really, testing and retesting and doing a bit of pilot testing the validity of your survey measures. So there's certain assumptions that we have about survey design. You'll have to excuse my croaky voice. I'm losing my voice and I'm fighting the flu at the moment. So we believe that our constructed world is a system of integrated causes and effects. And we believe that carefully planned and executed survey research can help us ultimately uncover these. Should point out, not everybody thinks this. And not everybody believes in the concept of personality, in the measurement of psychological constructs, and that they accurately reflect how people think and feel and behave. That's why whenever you conduct a survey, you need to present some validity evidence, either reliability, construct validity, factor analysis, etc. And we believe that it's actually feasible to assign numbers in most cases to measure these so that we can quantify psychological constructs. So it's putting the quant in quantitative analysis. Now, we're willing to make certain assumptions about the numbers representing these causes and effects and about their relationships. However, the validity of the conclusions being drawn depends strongly on the psychometric properties of the survey instruments employed, and in particular, whether they're pure measures of the construct of interest or instead whether they're contaminated by other factors like poor item wording, social desirability bias, etc. So even when the survey instrument is good, there still may be other causes, other sources of error present. That's something we need to be mindful of. So when conducting a survey, you've got a few choices. And they all centre around what's your research question. Is it something that you're doing for academic interest or because you've got to do a master's project? Or is it something that might have some real-world impact that might change the way other people in your profession practice? And it also depends too on what's your budget in terms of dollars and also time and energy. So time and energy to recruit these participants. So cost is a big driver in research data gathering. Online is probably the cheapest way. You're going to have to pay for your web hosting. So techniques like SurveyMonkey, they're not cheap, but they offer fantastic versatility and often better than you'll find, say, with the Lime survey or Qualtrics. But if you want to go face-to-face, then that's going to be the most expensive because it's investing your time to go out and locate these participants, spend time with them while they fill out the survey. But you're also going to have a greater control too over the quality of the data. With online, you never really know who's filling it out and how much attention they're paying. So cost is correlated fairly well with the response rate, with the sample quality, and with the participant's motivation. So you heard the old expression, if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. If you just whack your survey on a Facebook group and ask your friends to fill it out, well, the data quality is actually going to be rather poor and it's not going to be a representative sample. Particularly if there are moderators present, then you really want to source a representative sample. So we use things like course credit. We might give them a small token, such as a coffee voucher, etc. But this very rarely reimburses them for the time and effort that they put in. Ethics panels don't like large cash amounts as it's potentially coercive. If you're offering $100, well, that to you and me might mean a lot, but to some people that might mean, 3 or 4 meals. So they might participate in the survey just for the money and, they have diminished informed consent. But the flip side, and this is something that I do like to emphasize to researchers, is that you will be taking, if it's just course credit or a $5 coffee voucher, you're taking advantage of the participants' good nature. So in Australia, the minimum wage is $18.93 per hour. If you get them to fill out a survey, you just stole $20 from their pocket. So it's something to be considered when you're talking about recruiting participants. Now, if you're an organisational psychologist, there's some ethical issues there if the survey is compulsory and these employees are going to be asked to fill out the survey in their own time. Which is typically what happens, because they're too busy in the day. They don't have time free to actually sit down and fill out a survey in work hours. So I'm going to put up a link to a reading from Mitchell and Jolie, Chapter 8 on survey design and techniques, because I think it's very useful. It's a very easily and accessible chapter. We generally aim at second year, third year students, just so they understand the differences between different modes and also potential threats to validity and writing of items. So I'm just going to go through a brief overview, though, for those who aren't going to do the reading, of the different options. So mail is still a really useful way of collecting data. It has a lower chance of generating rapport. That can be important if you're going to get them to fill out sensitive information, or whether you need to get them on side to fill out a rather long survey. It also has lower control because, again, you're not supervising them. You don't know under what conditions they're filling it out. But it has much lower costs. You're only paying for the printing and the stamps. It does, though, have a much higher rate of non-response. Most people will not even open the envelope unless you have some enticing-looking envelope to trick them in. And because they can't ask questions, they may misunderstand the wording. So you need to be really sure that you've pilot tested your survey. There's the telephone survey, which has traditionally been used. As a comparison to mail, it's more rapport, so you can you're talking to someone, so you feel obliged to answer their questions, and you get a lower rate of non-response. But we'll talk about issues like silent numbers and mobiles and sampling. The problem is that not everyone has a landline anymore. Not everyone is at home in the day when you call them. So you're getting a very different demographic to what you would get with an online survey or paper and pencil or face-to-face or mail. Versus face-to-face, there's less chance of bias, especially on touchy subjects, but the training of your interviewers is really crucial. So you can actually lead the witness rather easily. Face-to-face, that has the highest rapport, because it's harder to say no to someone when you're looking them in their eyes. You're going to be more motivated to please them, and you have much greater data quality. So higher reliability, likely higher validity. On the downside, there could be the potential for demand characteristics, response bias, etc. They may be wanting to fill it out the way that or they think, rather, that you want to fill them out. Particularly, I'm thinking for organisational psychologists, when they know you've been called in with a particular agenda, they may be less candid, and they may fall Fowler demand characteristics. Now, of course, you can give face-to-face to deliver a survey, have them complete them in anonymity, and then have them return it in a sealed envelope. Or you come back to pick up the sealed envelope, and that sort of blends the best of a paper and pencil survey and face-to-face methodology. Then there's online. Now, it's a really cost-effective way of recruitment. The problem is that the demographic of participants that you get online will be very, very different to with a paper and pencil. Now, the actual reliability of items, there have been a lot of studies investigating this. Is it comparable? And in more challenging types of items where you need a high need of literacy, reading online, you're not going to have the same reliability. But for very simple questions, it actually works out to be just as effective as a paper and pencil. So provided you've pilot tested, I would strongly advise to pursue an online method of recruitment. The samples seem as representative as other modes, except for issues of age. So there'll be a very strong age bias. And particularly if you're doing a student subject pool, the students who complete it will be much more tech savvy and younger in age. So you may have trouble getting those older participants if you're using a subject pool. If you're using a list of employees, like in an organisation, generally computing and email is part of their everyday life, so it should probably be just as representative in that case, particularly if you're making it mandatory participation. Some potential problems, though, with survey data. One is misunderstanding the question. Oh, I thought you meant this. So, if anyone doesn't know, I'm a Coke addict. I drink Diet Coke like the sunshine, like it's going out of business. So I'm absolutely addicted to it. But if I say in casual conversation, and maybe this is a deficit in my theory of mind, people look at you like you've got two heads, and then it takes a while for them to realise you mean Coca-Cola, not cocaine. So, be very specific with your terminology. So I'm going to use an example here from Mitchell and Jolie on, it's a very Americanized example, of course, but on that theme of Coke, should Pittsburgh increase Coke production? Should it increase cocaine production? But if you lived in Pittsburgh, of course, you'll know that Coke is used in coal and steel. They mix them together. But you can see the different ways of that people would interpret it. Now, I'm not going to read this throughout, but I've highlighted it for you to read. The good old Clinton defense, I didn't know it meant sex. So, sometimes, depending on the type of survey that you're using, you might need to, in the instruction, give them a definition so it's very clear in their mind what you're talking about. Okay? Alright. Another problem is that participants might not have access to an explicit cognitive representation of the item. So it's usually that they lack insight into their psychological perspectives, their personality, their feelings, or that they just haven't completed too many surveys. There's often a practice effect with surveys. Now, there are certain psychiatric conditions, and I'm speaking, well, initially to the clinical students here, but you know that there's certain personality disorders, particularly borderline personality, where their self-image fluctuates quite considerably. as well as this image of others. So they may lack psychological insight. I don't want to be gender stereotypical here, but if you're asking about feelings and emotions, women will be more verbally expressive. Men, as a group, individuals vary, but they may lack self-insight into their degree, maybe, of sadness. Or for social desirability reasons, they don't admit to it. There's also some other conditions which organisational psychologists will no doubt be aware. There's a tendency towards, and maybe I'm showing my biases here, but there's a certain type of personality, the narcissistic personality disorder or the psychopath, that does very well in business. And in fact, they often do tend to rise to the top. Even though it may be devastating to those around them, it is, career-wise, it's an adaptive strategy. So they may not know their real feelings. They may portray a very false self. Or you might be asking them about hypothetical scenarios that are just not representative of real-life attitudes and decisions, particularly if you give them vignettes, short paragraphs of scenarios, and then you ask them to make decisions. So that's where pilot testing really is very important. There's also the issue of retrospective recall bias. So have any of you watched these shows like Highway Patrol, Highway Cops, where RBT, where they pull people over, and the first thing they ask is, how many beers have you had tonight? I've had maybe 2, or maybe 3, and then that little meter goes, bing, 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 and it says 0.256, so, you know, they've been drinking all night. They either can't remember or recall, or perhaps there's social desirability there. Another example, what food or drink items do you have yesterday in a dietary survey? Well, if I ask you what you had for breakfast today, I'm hoping that most of you can remember, assuming you did have breakfast. Can you remember yesterday? What about last week? So the further you ask backwards, the less likely they are to recall accurately. And so that's why with certain types of question, we may actually get them to record a diary as part of the survey. Now, the biggest issue is social desirability bias. I'm just going to briefly touch on it here, then I'll cover it in more detail in the threats to validity. Demand characteristics, though, that's where they're feeling compelled to answer in a certain way that they think the experimenter or the organisation commissioning the survey wants them to. So you'll often see these surveys that go around where they ask for your honest, candid feedback. They don't really want to hear the problems, though. And for the employees, there may be repercussions, even though it's anonymous, if a large number of employees complain. So people may be very reluctant to answer honestly. We also have the problems of response sets, where someone just goes tick, 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 tick. So a dummy vote, maybe they go in a diagonal, maybe they answer in the midpoint. These can really affect the reliability and validity of your items in your survey. Now, even if you have great items, you still have the potential for measurement error. So there's random error, which is the source of error in measuring a targeted variable that's caused by unpredictable fluctuations and inconsistencies of other variables in the measurement process that are noise. So, for example, if it were a test of ability, a student comes in sleep deprived, they come in drunk, they come in stoned and wasted, obviously they're not going to do well. Maybe they have test anxiety. But it can also serve to inflate their score as well on a test of ability. Maybe they're a good guesser. Now, in a survey, particularly if you're asking about moods or feelings, maybe they're having a really crap day. So it won't affect all participants, but it will introduce this sort of random error. Hopefully across all participants it will even out. Maybe if it's an organisational survey, maybe just in the last week they had a tough week and they've done a bit of unpaid overtime, or their supervisor isn't happy with their performance, so that might lower their opinion. Just pause for a moment. So we also have systematic error. So that's a source of error in measuring a variable that is typically constant across all participants or proportionate to what is presumed to be the true value of the variable being measured. In other words, it's error in the sampling method or error in the survey items, the reliability and the validity of the items. That you can do something about by choosing reliable survey items, piloting them, making sure that they are actually readable. Random error, unfortunately, really can't be something that isn't something that you can control for. So let's have a look at some sources of error at variance in surveys. So it may include survey construction, survey administration, survey scoring and interpretation, or other sources of error. And they're all important to consider. So survey construction, often it's poor item wording. It's ambiguous. So I'm going to give you an example. This one is taken from the MMPI-2, so it's an actual clinical scale. I am very seldom bothered by constipation. So I might interpret that two ways. I don't have constipation often, so I might strongly endorse that item. But other people, they might have constipation quite frequently, it just doesn't really bother them. Hey, maybe they even like it. So they may answer a low endorsement even though we were intending to actually tap their degree of constipation. So I kid you not, this is an actual item in the MMPI-2. I think it was a holdover from an earlier version. So when items are ambiguous, that makes it very difficult for participants to respond correctly. Often items are double-barreled. They're asking about multiple things. So, for example, teachers need to spend more time on students' emotional and educational development. Well, if I were happy with their educational development, but I think they need to spend more time on emotional, how am I going to answer that? Am I going to endorse it at a high level? Am I going to go for the midpoint? Because I really don't want to include that educational development. These double-barreled items are really problematic. And we see these time and time again in actual surveys that are reproduced in the literature. And yeah, sometimes they do pass peer review. But if you're starting out at the data collection phase and you're coming up with a survey, you need to check the psychometric properties of the items. You need to read through all the items. And if you're developing your own, you really need to do pilot testing. Sometimes the complexity of the language is a problem. From the IPIP, which is often used in personality development, I enjoy flights of fantasy. I don't have a clue what that means, and most participants won't. We'll interpret it very differently. I'm giving an example here from the BEM sex role survey. It has the personality trait conceited. And invariably when I'm collecting data on this, and I'm doing it face-to-face, I have students ask for a definition of the word. Now, I know what conceited is. They're very arrogant, they're very self-centered, they think they're always right, but not every reader will understand it. Now, fortunately, that's a distractor item that we don't even code, but, if that had have been an important item, then, the scale might need to be refined. The length of items. This is really critical on a survey. Short is good, less is more. You want it easy to understand, and so you try to keep most items under 10 words, 10 to 15, and certainly all under 20. If it's anything more than that, then it really slows down the completion time of the survey. It increases the complexity, and people are more likely to misinterpret it. Leading questions are a problem too, especially if you're doing an interview-based approach for your survey. So, do you approve of the terrible way Trump is handling the China trade war and undermining the American economy? Now, most people will feel rather attacked in such a situation, and they'll endorse that item because you're leading the witness and you're introducing demand characteristics, and you don't want to be the type of person that says, no, it's okay to undermine the American economy, so you're going to agree with it. Now, obviously this is a political example, but think about some of the types of questions that you ask. If you're not careful, you can lead people down a particular line of thinking. So, in a law drama, we'd say objection, honour, leading the witness. Now, socially desirable questions, and again, I will cover this in greater detail later, but this would depend on the nature of your survey and what it's asking. It'll affect some constructs more than others. If you're just asking rather innocuous questions, well, then people will probably be open and honest. But if you're creating a new survey to measure employee honesty and employee theft, don't for a moment think that you're going to get honest responses to that. So that's one of the problems with many honesty and integrity scales. They have this degree of social desirability, and there are things we can do to control for that. If you're asking about a history of self-harm, generally this is something that people are ashamed of. So you might want to ask indirectly initially, building up to it, and then asking explicitly. If you're asking about domestic violence, and here I'm thinking more of the perpetrators, it's not something that people readily admit to. So, if there's socially desirable question, you're going to have to ask indirectly and be subtle about it. Survey administration also introduces error. So you need to consider how a survey is administered. Is it a telephone interview survey? Is it a paper and pencil in your office or the employee's office or in your practice? Or is it online? Now, if you're doing it paper and pencil, simply stepping outside the room to give that illusion of anonymity might lead to a more candid response. Giving them a sealed envelope to put the paper and pencil survey in increases anonymity. But if you're going to their office and you're proctoring it and then you're pulling the paper back, they're not going to feel very anonymous, they're going to feel exposed. Or is it online? Now, as I mentioned, online surveys are really great, but they do represent a threat, certainly, to reliability, because people are distracted, they're not paying attention, they're multitasking. Especially true if you're using the subject pool, then your reliability and your conscientiousness will contaminate your research, and you will need a larger sample size than you would expect. So one of the things that I often notice when I'm doing tutorials or when I'm doing workshops is that I have first year students filling out online surveys in the tutorial while they should be working. Now, I don't actually mind too much, it's their loss, but I do feel very sorry for the poor honours researcher or the master's researcher who's trying to collect quality data. Students in particular like to multitask. So they might be watching TV in the background, listening to the radio, they might be having a conversation, and so they're not really reading your questions too deeply. And that's another reason why you want nice, simple questions. But if they're multitasking, maybe they're watching Netflix, hopefully not chilling, they might be filling out your survey as well. So you might get some really junk data there. And there might be some participants that, you just got to exclude. And I will cover that, how to identify some of those issues later on. Now, if you are supervising or proctoring the survey, you lose that anonymity feeling. If a survey is compulsory within an organisation, then the employees are smart enough to know that their responses are being tracked. They will not feel very anonymous, and so this is a consideration. Scoring and interpretation, well, if it's an online survey, it's pretty straightforward. As long as your SPSS skills are proficient and you're able to export it from the survey software, you'll be fine. And so if you're using a rating scale, it's very seldom a problem. The only instance I think that it might be problematic is if you're doing a paper and pencil survey. What I would suggest you do, rather than entering into SPSS, enter it into the online version of your survey and then actually transfer the answers over. And it's a lot easier than try to code it in SPSS because you'll actually see the questions and you'll see the response items. But what about if you're interpreting open-ended responses? You're coding a response for a certain personality trait or an attitude. What I would say, though, is that you shouldn't let this deter you. Qualitative research, which you'll be covered in another lecture, and open-ended questions can be really very useful. They will often stimulate ideas for future research projects because there will be questions that the participants want to answer that you haven't asked, and they may venture that information if you've got an open-ended one. And it really costs very little to have a couple of open-ended responses. All right. Other sources of error? Well, any other effect that consistently distorts the observed score. So sampling error. You remember the election opinion polls? Who saw old Trump, right? Sampling error occurs when the when the sample is not representative of the population. And this is because of demographic variables, socioeconomic status, or in the case of an election, simply the intention to go out and vote. Another reason that can be a problem is you have too small a sample size. So most commonly in psychology, we use the selected response format. And the process of scaling is the process of setting rules for assigning numbers in measurement. How do we quantify a response into a number? So you can see there in the bottom right there, L.L. Thurston, he pioneered many psychological scaling methods. So numbers can be assigned to written responses or choices to calculate test scores using a number of methods. Now, the different types of scales you use will determine your flexibility in answering questions. Scales are instruments to measure some trait or a state or perhaps an ability. And we're going to cover a variety of common formats. I bet you're thinking, no, there's only the like it. I've seen it before. That's what all surveys use. But there's actually quite a lot more. Now, before you write items, you need to consider how the items will be measured, so scaling. I'm just going to give you a very quick refresher. Feel free to fast forward for a couple of minutes. Nominal data is categorical and has no inherent value. An example, what is your gender? So male or female are the traditional choices. Because of the number of people who don't fit into that category, in particular who are transgender, you'll notice there are a small number now of transgender students appearing in the subject pool. So for inclusiveness, you might want to just have that other option, even though you may not find anyone ticks it. Male, female. And we generally dummy code that as 0 and 1 on a regression analysis. Things like employment status, so unemployed, part-time, full-time, retired. There's no inherent order here. So if we wanted to sort this as an ordinal piece of data, then we might put retired under unemployed and part-time a bit lower and full-time at the very top. So that way you would get an order of the amount of hours that they're working. So ordinal data is a ranking, first, second, third, and has an inherent order, like the order of completion of a race. So you might want to actually use ordinal data, and I'm thinking in particular for clinical, where if you were to ask them what's the most severe problem or symptom that they're facing, they might want to rank order it, or in an organisation, perhaps their preferences or the order of severity of certain workplace issues. But more commonly, you'll be using what we call an interval scale. So these are ratings with equally appearing intervals, usually 1. So interval scales are measurements that provide information about order and the magnitude of the difference. So an example here might be height. The difference between 2 and 1.5 is the same as the difference between 1.5 metres and 1. Now, there's some debate as to whether typical rating scales should be treated as ordinal or interval. Generally, when you add items together to form a total, you would consider it interval data. And this is particularly important if you're going to be doing scatter plots and things like that, because SPSS doesn't like doing nominal or ordinal data with a scatter plot. So SPSS, you see a screenshot here, it calls these items scale. Another distinction between types of measurement is the ratio format. So the distinction between an interval and ratio is that it has a 0 point. So height and weight for a person could be represented as ratio data. A Likert scale from 1 to 5, that's not ratio, that's interval. Now SPSS though isn't that picky. It calls that type of data scale too. So it's one of those theoretical issues you might want to think about, but it doesn't have any practical impact. So I'm going to show you some different rating scales now, and they take many forms depending on the type of sample and the purpose. So a graphical rating scale suitable for children, how are you feeling today? That's nice and easy. They don't have to use words or language, they just point to the picture or perhaps circle it. So these can be coded as a number though for analysis as a rating scale. So from happy to sad. A feelings thermometer is often used with children again. How angry or stressed are you feeling? So it is good for children, but it's also good for adults who lack psychological insight. It's probably more relevant to the clinical folks though than the organisational. Multiple choice, very common. A, B, C, or D. So which of the following is not a type of validity? Hopefully you would know that concrete boots validity is not real. That's where you weigh a body down with concrete and you sink them to the bottom of the river so they won't float. Not that I have personal knowledge. So multiple choice with only two options are referred to as a binary choice item, true or false. And so you'll often see these true or false checklists in clinical scales like the MMPI, in personality scales like the California Personality Inventory, but you might just have, the odd one or two binary choice scales in an organisational survey as well. Are you satisfied with your job, yes or no? Multiple choice items generally contain distractors, though, in order to discourage guessing. That's less of an issue, obviously, with a survey. An example of a bipolar rating scale, and this one comes from the Morally Debatable Behaviour Scale revised by Katz. It has no relation to the bipolar condition. It just means that there are two continuums. So cheating on an exam is never justified all the way through to always justified. Now we don't have any labels here. It's just a numerical scale. So that's a bipolar rating scale. It's often easier for some people to complete these because they don't have to read then the different labels or anchors on a Likert scale. Now, because it's interval data, test items can be summed together to form a total, and this is referred to as a summative scale. The most frequently used summative scale is the Likert, which I think you're probably all pretty familiar with by now. It's often employed to measure attitudes or personality traits, either of yourself, so as a self-report, or of others, what we would call informant reports. Typically presents a rating with 5 options. Sometimes people will go up to 7 if you want greater discrimination. There's an argument that some researchers make that you want an even number of items so there's no midpoint. This makes it harder for the person to make a choice, but then it stops them going for the middle option. And it's rated on a continuum, for example, from agree to disagree. And I've got here an example of a Likert scale, 1 to 5. Those items are taken from the Rosenberg self-esteem scale. It actually was a 4-point Likert scale, and it didn't have a midpoint. So these are purely illustrative. And you can see here we assign the numbers pretty easily. Likert scales are fairly easy to administer, and they require minimal instructions for participants to use. Although if you think this is the very first time that a participant will have filled one out, I would strongly advise you to have 1 or 2 example items and to show them how a response might be recorded. So it can be easily changed or adapted to capture other types of information simply by changing the labels or the anchors. So this one here is an example of a reflective response style, never or almost never true, all the way through to occasionally, then often, usually, and almost always true. So what might the same item that we saw before about cheating on the morally debatable behaviour scale look like expressed as a Likert scale? Cheating on an exam is tick 1, and we've gone here for sometimes justified, the midpoint. Now if it's an online one, it'll often be a radio button or a checkbox that they're clicking. So while Likert scales is the most common, there are actually many other types of scales that you may come across or that you may be completely unfamiliar with. And this is important when you're reading literature. It's also important if you want to capture a certain type of information and the Likert scale just won't be suitable. So an example here is the ipsative scale, or the forced choice. This is really useful for a socially desirable attribute like honesty, integrity. So the org psych people might, if you're trying to come up with an employee honesty scale, that's where you select the behaviour that you think would be either the best or the worst. So they've got to admit to one of them, or that they think one is better than the other, and they're equally socially undesirable. In fact, this is an example here, just 2 items, but you often have 3 or 4. You can do that too with personality traits to see which personality traits they empathise with more or identify with more. So ipsative scoring then compares a participant's score on other items of the test, across a whole lot of them, to come up with a total, and it shows where their priorities lay. So it's really good for countering social desirability issues. Another type of scale sometimes employed is the Gutmann scale. And this is where items range from weaker to stronger expressions of the attitude or belief. It's constructed so endorsement of one attitude indicates agreement with all preceding items. I'm going to give you an example of the Bogaerts' social distance scale. And it was initially conceived of in a time where it was okay to have boundaries in society, and it was okay to be slightly racist. Not overtly, but slightly. And initially it was developed for a target audience that the target would be African Americans, and you'd have to answer whether you would be comfortable associating with them. But for these purposes here, because I don't know the ethnicity of the participants enrolled in the course, I'm just going to have something generic like a foreigner. So I would be comfortable with a foreigner, and you have to tick 1. As a visitor to my country, yeah, I think I'm pretty cool with that. As a citizen, well, here some people might draw the line, but I actually like immigrants, so I would be okay with that too. What about a co-worker? I think I'd be okay to work with a foreigner or to have them as an employee, but if I change that to my employer, for a lot of racist people that would be beyond the pale. What about a neighbour on the same street? If I were rather tolerant, I'd say yes, that's quite okay. Now here's where you're going to get a lot of people. As a close personal friend, I'm not racist, some of my best friends are, so they would be happy to endorse that item. But this is where you'll lose them. As a family member by marriage, that would make some people uncomfortable. And if you think, for example, of a marginalised out group, so you're going back 50 years, it might have been Catholics in America. Today it might be refugees, it might be people who are Islamic. Then there are a lot of people who will actually have big issues and they won't endorse that last item. So suppose I was particularly racist. I might say I'm happy to have as a co-worker or an employee, and that would imply endorsement of all the previous items, but no way do I want to have one for my next door neighbour. By the way, that doesn't reflect my personal beliefs, I'm just trying to illustrate here. So you'll see there that we've got some numbers. That would be our level of social distance there. You wouldn't give the numbers because you wouldn't want to tip people off there. Now, once a response format has been selected, the next step is to actually construct those items. It's easy to write test items. People do it all the time. it's just not quite so easy to write them well. It's as much as art and as a science. So the more survey items that you write and then you analyse and you look at people's responses, you start to get a feel for how you would better measure personality or attitudes or beliefs and what types of items work and what types of items don't. But it does rely on a well-defined definition of the construct of interest so that you're not accidentally tapping other constructs when you're writing the items. And this will be particularly apparent when you do a factor analysis of your data after you've collected it back, and you'll find that that item just really didn't work. It also requires good theory of mind and perspective taking on the part of the test author. And you need to have a firm understanding of the audience you're going to be administering your survey to. So just a few tips on writing items, but these are covered in more detail in the Mitchell and Joly reading that I'll put up a link to. So clarity. Things like spelling and punctuation, grammar, they're really important. Works for a whole lot of reasons. Firstly, if there's grammar errors, it slows down the reading process because they've got to try to work out what you're asking. Secondly, it makes it look very unprofessional. It hasn't been checked. That lowers people's motivation. They're less likely to complete or to return it. But I want you to compare these two sentences. The panda eats, shoots and leaves. The panda eats, comma, shoots, comma, and leaves. So commas really matter. You can change the meaning of a sentence. That's an old linguistic joke. But, you know, try to pilot test your item. Get someone who's a non-psych person to actually read them. They should be succinct, generally less than 15 words, and ideally less than 10. And they should be suitable for the language level of participants. They shouldn't be overly complex linguistically and really try to avoid these double negatives. I mean, even reverse-coded items slow down the reading process, and so you really wouldn't want too many. So coming up in the next online mini-lecture, we're going to cover survey reliability and validity, so those statistical psychometric issues, as well as a very serious threat to validity in the form of social desirability bias.